Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to talk about film versions of books. So, film versions of books, it's kind of a tricky thing. Sometimes it works, and when it works well, it's great. Sometimes it doesn't work, and it just fails horribly, and you wonder why they even bothered to try to make this adaptation in the first place. It's always a really tricky thing for some reason. Even though we have lots of examples of film adaptations of books that are really good, we have just as many, if not more, adaptations that are much worse than the book. And so I wanted to get into sort of why this is, why some adaptations work, some don't, and what is going on with all of that. Now, talking about adaptations in the first place, one question that you see a lot online is sort of why do they need to adapt it? Because if the book is already good, why do you need to sort of transpose the story of the book into another medium? And there's a couple different reasons for that. The first is just that it's a new way to look at the story. It's a different medium. Film is a visual medium, and so there's lots of things you can do in film that you can't do in books. Books, of course, are very different, and they can do a lot of things that film can't. So the book and the film are always going to be sort of two separate things. But also, it's always just fun to see how someone else interprets your favorite characters. Sometimes there's a character that you have in your head and you can see exactly how they seem and how they sound. But then the film version is a little bit different, but the actor or actress does such a good job that, you're like, wow, I really like what they brought to the story, and they added depth to the character that I didn't even realize was there to start with. And so it is exciting, and I know Hollywood tends to be sort of this giant grinding machine that sort of repackages everything that's been done before. And a lot of the things that are most popular are remakes and sequels and that kind of stuff, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think adaptations, when done well, add something to the original book, and so they are still valuable in some cases if they're done right. There really is no perfect formula for how to adapt a book well into film, but there are a couple examples of times that it was done really well. And in both of these examples, the film actually fixes some mistakes with the books, or it changes the feel of the story in ways that work much better in film than they did in the book. So let's talk about, first off, I wanted to talk about Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I recently reread this, and while I still really enjoyed the characters and the story, the ending left a lot to be desired. It has kind of a weird ending where the characters the relationships all feel like they're everyone's second choice, and they just sort of happen because they're convenient or because they're sort of less dramatic than the other options. And so it doesn't really have a mega satisfying conclusion in terms of the relationships. The characters have really good arcs, and I really like Eleanor and Marianne's sort of journey through the book. It's still a good book. Jane Austen is still fantastic, but I think her plotting gets stronger with her later books. This was her first book, and the way that this book ends isn't really that satisfying. But in the 90s, Ang Lee did a film version of it with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet and Alan Rickman. It's a great cast, and Emma Thompson herself adapted the screenplay, and everything just works really, really well in that film. But in order for it to work, they had to sort of adjust some things from the books to make the plot work a little better. So one thing that Thompson did when she was writing it is she enhanced the relationships at the heart of the story, and she also sort of adapted the overarching journey that the characters go through to make it sort of make more sense to us, because there's a lot of things in this book that Regency readers would have understood, but modern day readers may not quite understand. One good example is the Dashwoods sort of have a change in their fortunes at the beginning. Inheritance money ends up going to another member of the family, and he has quite a scheming, greedy wife, and so she convinces him to sort of limit the amount of money that they're going to get, and this causes them to have to sort of rethink their whole thing. Now in the book, we can't really, like, it's harder for us in the modern day to sort of understand how much of a change that they had to go through, because there's a lot of cultural stuff that has changed since the Regency era. And so, for example, the house that they end up going to, we read it now and we're like, you got this huge house, why is this a bad thing? And there's sort of elements in the story that readers of Austen's day would have picked up on. It's not so much the fact that they're living in squalor or anything, but it's the fact that there's this insult that they've had to sort of take lesser accommodations to get by, even though lesser accommodations is still a huge cottage in the country, in, you know, a really beautiful part of the country. But in the film version, what I really like is Thompson adds this scene where they have to dismiss a bunch of servants, and she sort of exaggerates their wealth in the beginning to make that change from where they were to where they end up feel more obvious to the audience. And I think that works really well, because there's this great scene, and it's not in the book, but there's a great scene early on where Mrs. Dashwood is sort of having to say goodbye to all the servants, and she's just really not having a great time, and there's this sense that she's gonna, you know, she has to do everything herself now, and she's very overwhelmed by all this, and it really does kind of show that they're sort of having to lose a great deal of their means and have to make do with much less. But I mean, they're still having a huge house, they still have some servants, so, you know. But the change in their fortunes is much more obvious, which I think works really well. Another thing that works really well in the film version is the relationship. So the central relationships in the book, it feels more like at the end, the two male love interests sort of do the right thing to take care of the Dashwoods, but there's not a lot of like romance involved. It's more like they're going to be quite gallant and marry these two women because it's the right thing to do, and they're going to take care of them, and you know that they're good people, so they're going to be fine. But it doesn't feel like there's a lot of love involved. And like, again, the nuances of courtship in the landed gentry in the Regency era are very different, and a lot of times they didn't marry for love. But I think the film version does a really good job of at least establishing chemistry between the characters, showing how the relationship develops, and there's two really good kind of additions that I think enhance this. One is Colonel Brandon and Marianne. In the book, Colonel Brandon's a good guy, but he doesn't have a lot of time with Marianne. Like, they don't really fall for each other. It's more she doesn't really care for him at first. She's obsessed with Willoughby, of course, and Willoughby is not a good guy. But so for a great deal of the book, she's pining after Willoughby, and she doesn't really like Colonel Brandon because he's so much older than she is. And then at the end, it's sort of like, well, I guess he's sort of a good choice, and then they get married. But in the film version, they do add some more elements in the way that the relationship is set up, and a lot of this goes to Alan Rickman and his performance, which is so good, but he adds a lot of depth to the character, where we see that he genuinely is taken by Marianne, and he respects her outlook on life, and he really does adore her, but he doesn't want to be improper, and so he doesn't say anything for a long time because he knows that she's obsessed with someone else. And he sort of respects that. But then when everything comes to a head with Willoughby and we learn that he's garbage, when Colonel Brandon sort of steps in and takes her hand and marries her, it feels a little more earned, because we see that he has a lot to offer her, and there's things about her that he adores, and so we see that they're a good fit. It's still a little weird because he's so much older than she is, but I think their ages are a little bit adjusted in the film version as well, so it doesn't feel quite so weird. I think in the book she's like 16 or so and he's in his 30s, which, you know, that's quite an age gap, but in Regency times that was sort of okay. But I think the film version ages Marianne up a bit and just makes it work a little bit better. Another element that the film version fixes is the relationship between Eleanor and Edward Ferrars. So again, they don't get a lot of time together. She does kind of fall for him first, and she sort of thinks that he's, you know, pretty wonderful, and she's, you know, she's quite taken with him, but he sort of is very distant, and he ends up sort of engaged to someone else, and then that engagement falls apart, and then at the end again it's sort of like, well, you're my second choice, so I'll marry you. And it doesn't quite work. But in the film version they add this really cute moment where Eleanor has a third sister named Margaret, and all throughout the film she's obsessed with this like world atlas that she has, and she loves geography. And there's a moment when she's kind of hiding under a table and she doesn't want to come out, and Eleanor doesn't want to like have a direct confrontation with her, and so Edward is sort of there, and she realizes that the way she can get Margaret out is by sort of having a moment with Edward where they talk about bad geography facts that are incorrect. And I think actually Edward starts it and she sort of plays along with him. And so he kind of notices that Margaret is sort of being sullen and hiding under the table. And so he kind of initiates this thing where he starts talking about he asks her about geography facts, and she sort of plays along and gives incorrect geography facts, and eventually Margaret gets mad and comes out from under and has to correct them because they're getting everything wrong. But it's a cute moment because it shows that Edward and Eleanor have a similar sense of humor, they have kind of a similar dry wit, and they get along really well, they have really good chemistry, and it's a cute moment so that when he does propose to her at the end, it really does feel earned, and it feels like these two were sort of meant to be together, and it just works really, really well. It's such a good movie. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's one of my favorites. I love it so much. Now, another example of a film version of a book that sort of took the book in a new direction, but it worked, was Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Now, the film and the book are some of my favorites. I love them so much, but the book is very much kind of a taut techno thriller / like creature horror, and it's very kind of grim and violent, and it's tense and it's scary, and it's really, really good. But the movie version sort of distills it down to more of like an adventure movie where there's a little bit more humor, there's more like wonder, it's more fun, I think, than the book version. The book is fun because it's scary and tense and fast-paced. The film is fun because it's sort of big and grand, and it kind of gives you the excitement of like, what would it be like if dinosaurs were real, kind of thing. And the book and the movie work very well in different ways. Both the book and the movie are essentially sort of retelling the Frankenstein story, where you have sort of scientific hubris that creates something, and then the creation turns on its creator because there's this illusion of control that the creator has, and the creator sort of just feels like they just deserve to be in control of this thing that they've created, but the thing that they've created is sort of more complex than they assumed, and the creation sort of seeks to find its own place in the world, and there's this just, you know, conflict there. And it works really well in both cases. The book is a lot more cynical, and the book is also a lot more sort of criticizing sort of the profit motive of it all. The film does touch on it, but again, I think the film harps more on this sort of the illusion of control, because there's two sort of big conversations that happen between, you know, Ian Malcolm and John Hammond when they're having dinner, and then between Ellie and John Hammond when they're sort of eating all the ice cream that's melting in the freezer when the power went out. And those two conversations are kind of the crux of the movie. They don't really happen in the book. The book is a lot more about like mathematical probabilities and chaos and the inability to predict something. Because in the book, the dinosaurs get out a lot earlier. It's not because of Dennis Nedry sort of scrambling the system. That happens later, but the system is already breaking down even when everything's working perfectly. And in the book, the dinosaurs have already escaped, and they're already making it to the mainland, and they're already hunting people on the mainland, even though they're not supposed to. And so like the system breaks down naturally, and then Dennis Nedry's actions sort of shake things up in bigger ways. Whereas in the movie, it's much more like Dennis Nedry sort of starts everything, and then things start happening as a result of his actions, and that's what causes all the chaos. So it's sort of like if he hadn't done that, the park would have been fine. Whereas in the book, the park is doomed from the beginning, even before things go wrong. So they're telling kind of different stories. The book also ends with John Hammond and Dr. Wu sort of meeting very sticky ends. John Hammond sort of has this moment where he sort of refuses to understand why it failed, and he gets angry and storms off and runs into the woods and gets got by the dinosaurs. In the film, there's this moment where, like, at the end, he survives and he sort of learns from his mistakes, and he's able to sort of realize what he did wrong. Whereas in the book, it's sort of, he sort of dies unredeemed, and he's much more of a villainous kind of character, sort of this angry capitalist who's seeking to control things and make money off of it. Whereas in the movie, it sort of gives him a little bit more grace and allows John Hammond to survive and sort of learn from his mistakes, and, you know, he ends up sort of okay. But I think the film version just works a little bit better because it allows the story to be a little bit more fun. It isn't just quite relentless action terror kind of thing. There are scary moments in the film, obviously, but it also kind of speaks to this childlike sense of wonder and awe, and the dinosaurs are cool, whereas in the book they're terrifying. And so I think both work really well in different ways, and unlike Sense and Sensibility, I don't think there's anything really wrong with the book. The only thing I would say is, and this is just a thing Michael Crichton does in general, his characters do tend to be a little flat. Whereas in the movie, of course, the actors all do a really good job of giving their character a lot of depth and personality. And like the entire main cast in the film, all of them are sort of lovable and fun, except for the bad guys, but they're interesting nonetheless. And I think in the book, it's more of a little more detached from the characters. We're not as invested in sort of their personalities. It's more like they're there to observe the breakdown of this system. But either way, I think the film and the book work really well in different ways. Now, there are also books that adapt the books very well, but do so by sort of being very faithful to the original book. And you don't see this as often. I think this is harder to do because you either have to change the book to make it work for screen, or you have to adapt it in some way to kind of shift things around. But there are a couple examples of books where they just worked really well by just adapting the story fairly accurately. And those examples are The Life of Pi by Yann Martel and The Hours by Michael Cunningham. Both of these are really phenomenal books. I really like both of them. I know this one can be kind of notorious because it's a little pretentious and full of itself, but it's still really beautiful, and I quite like it. This one is a magical realism. It's a story that's being told by someone who survived being lost at sea with this tiger, and he tells a story to the interviewer as a means of teaching him a point that he thinks is really important. And it all hinges on this sort of moment at the end where he sort of asks the interviewer a question about what he's just heard, and that the way that he answers that is sort of the crux of the whole story. I'm not going to give it away because it's really genuinely good, but the book is beautiful. The film is gorgeous. Ang Lee also directs this one, just like Sense and Sensibility. He is very, very talented. I love his directing style. But the visuals in this, it really does feel like he just took the book exactly to screen. And there's a few things that had to be trimmed out, obviously, to make it work, because it's a longer book and there's lots of details. But the movie captures the feel and the main idea and the characters of the book really, really well. And the same goes for The Hours. Now, I know the movie version is kind of notorious for also like the book being sort of slow and pretentious. But I don't care because I genuinely love the movie and the book. This is another one where the book is sort of it's like a send-up of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and it's about Mrs. Dalloway because Virginia Woolf is a character in the book as well. It's very postmodern, exploring the themes of the book in different ways. There's 3 different time periods, and the film version does a really good job of sort of capturing the feel of the book, the characters, the texture of the story really genuinely feels like the movie just took the book directly to screen. And the hinge point in this book is sort of the death of the artist, and the book and the movie sort of both sort of make that moment work really well. So this is another example of like, you can adapt the book fairly faithfully and it works well. This is a pretty short book, so I think that's why it worked, but it's just really good. One thing that also makes me laugh is that the book, there's a moment where a character mentions Meryl Streep, and then of course Meryl Streep is in the movie as one of the characters, so it's kind of meta. But it's really interesting, and I like the way that the director was able to take the essence of the book and translate it to screen very faithfully without having to sort of change anything drastically, which is hard to do. So that's quite an accomplishment. Now, if you were to ask me what makes a film adaptation good, I don't know if I could really put it into words, but there's a few things that, you know, when you look at sort of successful adaptations, what are some commonalities? And I think a big thing is that the script needs to, one, be written by someone who genuinely loves the source material and wants to kind of capture it faithfully, or at least adapt it in a way that is respectful of the original source material. But they also need to trust the audience. A lot of times when you have an adaptation that's bad, it's usually because they don't trust the audience and either over-explain things, or they cut out important things in favor of just crowd-pleasing flashiness just for the sake of it. And so it's difficult to say, but I think when you have a script that trusts the audience, and then you have a director who trusts the script, then I think it works really, really well. A good example of that is the Lord of the Rings films versus the Hobbit films. The Lord of the Rings films, they do change quite a few things from the book. It's a good adaptation and it's very successful. Those movies are practically perfect, but they did have to change quite a bit from the original books to make it work on screen. There's plot points that are different, there's character things that are different. There's a lot of things that are changed. It feels very accurate to the book because it captures the feel of the book really well. But in terms of the plot, there are quite a few differences and things that they had to change to make it work. But it's very good because it trusts the audience. It doesn't try to pander, really. There are maybe a few moments, you know, there's one scene of like Legolas surfing down, you know, an Oliphant, and that is a little goofy. But overall, the films trust the audience to understand what they're doing, and they trust them in the sense that the films don't really have to pander too much. The films feel timeless because they didn't have to sort of marvel it up in any way to make it sort of appeal to a wider audience. They appealed first and foremost to Lord of the Rings fans, and they did a good job, and so the films became sort of widely beloved. Now, looking at the Hobbit films, which I do still love, I'm not here to bash the Hobbit films. I do still love them. I think the actors all did a really good job. But with those, you can tell that, I don't know if it was Peter Jackson or if it was studio execs who got too involved, but you can tell that one sort of doesn't trust its audience. There's this kind of sense where it's like, we know you're going to be bored, so here's an outrageous action set piece that just goes on and on and on and gets bigger and bigger and more outrageous because we know that you're bored and you're not going to care about this. Whereas with Lord of the Rings, there's long stretches where there isn't a lot of action, but it's still compelling because the characters and the plot and the emotional journeys of everyone is what we're invested in. But the Hobbit movies sometimes don't trust us enough. And so they say, here, look, here's something flashy because we know you're probably bored because you don't like that slow character stuff. And there is still good character moments in those movies, and overall, I think they're still enjoyable. But you can tell that there was more interference to make them sort of bigger and flashier, sort of for no reason. A really good example of this is, when Smaug is attacking the dwarves, and they make this like giant gold statue that immediately melts and coats him with gold. It just feels a little ridiculous because the physics of it doesn't work. It's very CGI. It just feels cartoonish almost. And there's other ways they could have kind of done that moment. I don't know. It just feels a little silly. But I wish that sort of Peter Jackson had been allowed to sort of move at his own pace. Now, it's obvious that he wouldn't have been, because the Lord of the Rings films were so popular that obviously the Hobbit films were meant to sort of capitalize on that, and they wanted to reach a wider audience because there's this profit motive. They wanted to make as much money as possible, and so they sort of added stuff to pad it out and turn it into 3 films, and added a bunch of extra action stuff just for the sake of it. And I think that's part of the reason why they don't work as well. But I will say, I do appreciate that the Hobbit films give us that moment that isn't in the book, but where Galadriel gets to go beast mode on the bad guys. It's perfect. I love that moment so much. And so I don't want to really talk about any other movies that sort of adapted the source material badly, because I'll just get mad and I don't want to rage farm. But don't watch the movie Troy, I'll just say that. Moving on. But here are some books that I think could make really good adaptations if the scriptwriter and the director understood the source material well enough and trusted the audience well enough. The first one is Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars series. There's a trilogy of books, then there's a collection of short stories, and I really think this could work. I don't know if it would maybe work as a trilogy of films. It might, if it does it right, but I think this might work better as maybe a TV series, 3 seasons of a show. The books are so complex and interesting, but they're always character focused. The dynamics between all the different characters are really compelling, and the world building is great. But the scriptwriter needs to understand these are socialist books. They're all about sort of the messiness of nation building and the complexities of creating a society that's fair to all people while fighting the pushback against sort of entrenched capitalist ideas. And you really need to understand that if you're going to adapt this. If you turn this into just drama for the sake of drama, I don't know if it would work. So, if they ever do adapt this, I'd love to see the folks who did The Expanse adapt this, because they're not similar in terms of their themes, but in terms of the complexity of the world building and everything, I think they would do a good job of it. But I love this series so much, and I think it could work, but it would have to be done correctly. Another example is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a short book, so I think this would work really well as a single film, but it's just wonderful. It's like historical fantasy, it's god punk, it's beautiful, it's jazz age, and it's, I don't know, I think this could even work as like maybe an animated film, but like not a kid's animated film, like an adult animated film with the sort of complexity and maturity of something like The Book of Kells or Prince of Egypt, something like that, because the visuals in this are really compelling. And I don't know, I just think it could work really well. The characters in this are great. The central sort of core of the story is very simple and universal, and I think that would translate really well to a film version. I would love to see this be adapted to film. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. Silvia Moreno Garcia is very smart, and she doesn't really let things be optioned unless she really trusts who's doing it. And I think there's been a couple times when a few of her books have been optioned, but they didn't proceed with anything. So if it does get adapted, we know it'll be done correctly because, we trust her. She's a good, this story is going to be in good hands, whoever writes the script. And then finally, we've got The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. This is one of my favorite fantasy series ever. This is one that I think would work again as a TV series. The books are all quite long, so I don't know. In the current day, TV shows rarely last longer than 2 or 3 seasons, and there's 3 books. So if they needed to, I think they could do it in 3 seasons, but I would kind of want it to be maybe 5 seasons so they could sort of get everything, because they are quite dense. But the character arcs, the satisfying ending at the end of the 3rd book, the progression of all of the complex clan rivalries and everything is so good. This could really be one of those like great TV shows, kind of like early Game of Thrones, where everyone was watching it, everyone was obsessed with it. But again, it would have to be done well, and it would have to be done by a studio that was committed to actually doing the whole thing, not just making one season to draw people in and make money, and then making another season to sell subscriptions and then canceling it after that. We don't want that. We want someone who's going to actually do this correctly. I don't know if this would work as 3 films, but if it needed to be 3 films, I think it would be possible. You'd have to simplify the plot quite a bit, but it could still work. But I don't know. This is one that if they did it wrong, it would hurt me forever and I would be upset. But if it was done right, this could be a really incredible world to just spend time in and see on screen, because it's so cool and I love it so much. I don't know, maybe Apple TV could do it. Apple TV seems to be the only streaming service right now that's sort of adapting things well and putting out really good quality like TV shows. It's kind of baffling, but because not as many people have Apple TV, but they're doing really good stuff. So I don't know. With that said, what are your favorite adaptations from books to movies or other things? Book to TV shows, book to musicals, anything like that. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your favorite adaptations. You can also talk about the ones that you hated, just as a chance to vent and talk about adaptations that just ruined the source material and it made you mad. Go ahead and do that too if you want. So with that said, I'll let you go. I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.